There was one moment that I was thinking, oh shit. There it is. Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today we have returning special guest Vincent, and what we're going to do for Vincent today is we're going to do a front wheel bearing job on his Lexus LX470. Before we get going with the job, let's show you all the parts Vincent bought for this job. Here's all the parts that Vincent bought for the front wheel bearing job. Everything on this side is 100% necessary for the job. Everything on this side is optional. So let's start with the necessary parts. You're going to need 2 large bearings. You need 2 smaller bearings. You're going to need 2 of these seals. That's the part number for each of them. You're going to need 2 flange gaskets. This part can be debated whether it's 100% necessary or not, because you can rebend these. This is the retainer that doesn't allow the set nut and lock nut to move when you fold the tabs over, but I would say it's a good idea to replace these because after you bend metal, it fatigues and it might not 100% last for you. So that's the part number for that. And then you're gonna need a quality wheel bearing grease, and Vincent and I both like the Redline CV2 grease for wheel bearings. It's a high quality, high temperature grease, and I don't think there's anything much better on the market than Redline. Let's start with the optional things. These dust covers can absolutely be reused, but they could get a little bit mangled when you take them off. So it all depends how careful you are in the removal of them to how well they're going to survive this job. Vincent bought these flanges, and I don't see any reason to replace these unless you found some type of crack or corrosion really ate away at them. But if you want to replace these, here's the part number for both of them. These are the nuts that hold these flanges onto the vehicle, and nuts can 100% be reused. You don't have to replace these. But again, if they are rusted up and not looking that great, maybe you want to replace them, and that's the part number. Here's the washers for those nuts, and again, these could be reused, but if they are rusty and looking pretty bad, maybe you want to replace them. That's the part number. These washers, unless they're galled out because maybe the bearing was spinning against it, I've seen that before where it digs a groove into it. But if they are 100% intact and there's nothing wrong with them, these can be reused. Here's the part number for those. And then you have these nuts. These can either be the adjuster nut or the lock nut. Technically, if he was going to be replacing them all, he'd want 4 of them because there's 2 per side. But if you wanted to replace those, that's the part number there. This is the part number for the cone washers. This is a part that you could absolutely reuse unless you found that they were super rusty and corroded, then maybe you want to replace them. So that's all the parts. Now let's get out to the truck and get started with the job. One thing I failed to say is a Lexus LX470 is nothing more than a fancy 100 series Land Cruiser. So everything we're showing you today would also work for a 100 series Land Cruiser. For this job, you're going to want to remove the front skid plate. I really like jacking up the vehicle under this really beefy front cross member. There is a cross member behind it, but that's a little bit smaller, and I'd rather support the weight of the vehicle on this really heavy duty front cross member rather than the smaller one behind it, because you might end up denting it. And in the rear, we have both of the rear wheels chalked and the parking brake set, so the vehicle can't go anywhere. We're gonna get some jack stands in place on each frame rail, and then we're gonna settle the weight of the truck on the jack stands. All right, we have the frame settled on 6-ton jack stands on both sides, and now we're gonna get the wheels off. Before I take off the wheels, I wanna show you how you can properly check for wheel bearing play. You wanna grab the wheel at the 12 o'clock position and the 6 o'clock position, and you pull and push with opposing force with your hands to detect any play. So when I rock it back and forth, I can feel the play, I can hear it, and that means that it's time for a wheel bearing job. Some guys try to check for wheel bearing play by grabbing at the 3 o'clock and the 9 o'clock position, but that's just going to be testing for play in the steering. So always grab at the 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock and that's how you can figure out if you have wheel bearing play. We're going to start on the passenger side. The first thing we need to do is get the brake caliper disconnected so we can pull the rotor and hub assembly off. What I've learned is if you turn the wheel one way or the other, it's going to give you better access. For the passenger side, if Vincent turns the steering wheel all the way to the left, that's going to open up more room to where we can get to the caliper bolts much easier. And then with the other side, we would turn the wheel all the way to the right to be able to get to the caliper bolts easier. So that's an optional step, but I do suggest you do it for the ease of getting to the bolts. And as you can see, look at all the additional room we have to work now. We're not working in a tight area back here near the sway bar. We've got all this extra room to work. To get the caliper free and out of the way, I want to disconnect this brake line bracket right here. It's a 12mm bolt, so I have the ability to swing the caliper way out of the way of where I'm working. I'm going to use my little 1/4-inch DeWalt gun with an extension to do that. I'm just going to put that bolt right back in there so I don't have to keep track of it. Now I'm going to get onto the two 17mm caliper bolts. There's one here, and then there's one up here. And I'm going to use my 3/8 DeWalt gun with a deep 17mm socket and see if I can get those out. And I was supporting the caliper while I was taking that second bolt out because it could just drop out on you. And then I'll just pull the caliper off the rotor. I have these caliper hooks. I'm going to hook it here, and then I'm going to just figure out where I can hang it to where I'm not putting any strain on the brake line. So what I'm hanging the caliper hook on is part of the automatic height control system that Vincent deleted from this vehicle. He no longer has the AHC system. And I actually have a video for that too. If you click on the link above, you can see that video of me deleting the AHC system on a buddy I used to work with at the fire department. I did it on his LX470. But Vincent took it a step further and removed a lot of the components that are along the frame rails, which I didn't do for my buddy at work. So now that we have the caliper off and hung out of the way, I'm going to have Vincent turn the wheel back straight to where we can do the next step. The next thing we want to do is get these grease caps off. And you can see that there's signs that this has been removed before. So before Vincent bought this vehicle used, somebody obviously was in here because you can see the damage that they did to the cap. And I'm going to try to get these caps off without damaging it any further. But Vincent did buy replacements of these, so it's really a non-issue if I damage it. But I really want to show you you can get these things off without mangling them if you use the right succession of tools. So what I have here is a fine chisel that's part of an air hammer kit, but it has a very slim knife edge blade to it. This will be able to get in between the grease cap and this flange on the axle and hopefully not destroy it. I'll get my ball peen hammer and I'll just knock on it lightly. And I got a little separation already. I'll hit it in a few different spots. I'll turn it. And that's it. It's as easy as that. If you have the right tool, you're not going to mangle it. But the previous mechanic or owner used probably a screwdriver or something that was a little thicker, and it ended up damaging the grease cap. Next, we're going to remove this snap ring with a pair of snap ring pliers. You want to get the open end exposed at the top so you can easily get on there. I'll hook it and slide it off, just like that. Next, I'm going to loosen all these flange nuts. So now with the nuts backed off a little bit, I'm going to use a brass drift and I'm going to hammer and I'm going to try to shock the cone washers loose. I'm already seeing that the previous mechanic or owner forgot to put one of the cone washers in there or they lost it. So I don't have to do this one, but I'm going to do all the other 5. Those suckers are in there. Okay. This might take a while. I wasn't getting anywhere with this smaller brass drift, So I decided to just take the nuts and washers off and use a much bigger brass drift and a mini sledge and see if I could break these free. The whole point of keeping the nut on there is when you knock loose the cone washer, it could go flying out. So that's the risk I'm going to take, but I just wanted to get the nut out of the way to avoid striking the nut and potentially messing up the threads. So let's see how this goes. Okay, that finally worked. Okay, so that one's loose. It's just not popping out that much. I'm used to these cone washers coming out really easy, but it might just because there's a lot of dried grease and grit in there and it's not allowing the cone washer to easily slide off the stud. Yep, that one's loose. And you get the idea. I'm gonna keep knocking these loose and then I'll come back. Now that I got them all loose, I'm gonna pull out the cone washers with a pair of slip joint pliers. Just gotta grab onto it and work it back and forth. There's just a lot of dirt on here stopping them from coming off, so that's what they look like. So I now have all of them off and I can remove this flange from the hub. I'm just gonna tap on it a little bit in a couple spots to help release it from the hub. Just be careful and don't hit the threads of the studs. A better tool will be a brass hammer. I just don't feel like grabbing it right now. Got a little bit of movement. I think I'm going to get in here with a flat blade screwdriver and just give a little light prying to get it out. Instead of the screwdriver, Vincent had this trim removal tool from Snap-on. This will do the job. Just going to get it between the hub and the flange and start working it around. There we go. And the gasket came with it. So now with the flange off, I'm seeing some things that I don't necessarily like. I can see clear signs that the person who did this job last didn't have the proper size 54mm socket for these lock nuts and the adjuster nut behind it. Because I could see where they took a screwdriver and they hammered on one edge of the nut to be able to tighten it. So I could say with 100% certainty that the reason why this job probably failed was from error from the mechanic or the owner. It wasn't done right. And then you see the retaining washer. The proper way to do it is to bend one tab over the adjuster nut behind, and then you bend one tab on the lock nut in front. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bend the tabs of the locking washer out of the way so I can get onto this with my 54mm socket. Okay, it looks like I've got all of the tabs out of the way, and now I can get onto this with the socket. This thing is really loose. I don't even have to get onto it with a ratchet. And then now with the lock nut out of the way, I can slide this locking washer off. So you can see that one side was folded over the adjuster nut. So they did do that correctly. And now I'll get onto the adjusting nut and take that one off. And that one's hand tight too. So this wheel bearing job didn't last because I think they just did it wrong. So with these adjusting and lock nuts, they have a sort of rounded side and one side that is nice and machined flat. And with my experience, the flatter machine side goes up against the bearing and it's not flipped the other way around. So I found that they had this side against the washer, which goes against the bearing, and I don't think that's the right way to do it because that's not what I saw when I did a similar job on my 85 4Runner. They were in the reverse orientation. So there's a washer in here that you can't really see because of all the grease. So I'll pull the hub off a little bit and then I'll get to that. So this is that tooth washer here. I'll clean it off so you can see it better. So you can see how it's keyed so it slides into the slot on the axle. And then I can get the outer bearing off, and then I can slide the hub all the way off. Just like that. This is kind of interesting. This is the ring that the ABS sensor is taking a reading off of. So it's basically part of the hub assembly. Now that we have the hub assembly off, what I'm going to do is I'm going to support it on a couple 4x6s up on end to clear the studs of the ground so they're not grinding into the concrete. To get the rear bearing out, I need to remove this seal. And I'm just going to use a hook seal puller like this. This one's from, I think it's Lyle. So I'm going to hook it underneath here and then lever it out. And you have to put a little counter pressure here to get it going. So I'm going to do it in several spots and try to get it going here. You just don't want to go in too deep and score the edge here. Okay, got a little bit of movement. There we go, finally. And then we could pull out our inner bearing, which is the bigger of the two bearings. Now I'm just going to get in here with some rags and paper towels and clean out all the old grease. We have the inside of the hub cleaned out really nicely. In this cavity right here, you're going to find a lot of grease. If the previous person did it correctly, you want to pack that void with grease. So you're going to be wiping quite a bit of grease out of there. Now, what I want to show you is these indentations right here. There's 4 areas where you can get in there with a brass drift or a punch and knock the race out. So that's what we're going to do now. In this orientation, we can knock out the outside race, and then we have to flip the assembly over to knock this race out because there's going to be cutouts underneath this race that will allow us to get in there and knock it out. Now, I will say that I have used steel punches in the past to knock these races out, and I ended up scoring the inside of the hub by doing that because the tool is glancing off and hitting on the inside. So I really recommend just using brass drifts for this job so you don't accidentally damage the inside of your hub. So I'm going to come in with the brass drift, and I'm going to come in at a little bit of an angle. I'm not going to go straight up and down because then the tool is going to be likely to glance off and just slip off. So I'm going to come in a little bit of an angle, and I'm going to strike it. Give it a couple whacks. I'm going to go right across to the opposing side and give it a couple strikes. Then I'm going to go to the other 2 notches and give those each a couple strikes. And the reason why you want to be equal with this is if you just keep on hitting on one side, you're going to start driving it out crooked. So just do it gradually. 2 strikes in each spot. And just keep working your way around doing that. It's almost out. There it is. So I'll flip it over, and you can see the race we drove out. So now we're going to come in and we're going to knock out the inside race. Same technique. There it is. So we have both races out. Now we have to knock in the new ones. The wheel bearings come with the races. It's not a separate part. We were all ready to drive in the new races, and I realized that for the bigger inner race, I don't have a seal driver that will be big enough to capture it properly. In this OTC kit that I have, this is my biggest one, and you see that it doesn't fit right. You want a big enough race driver that this outer lip comes in contact with this lip, and you're not putting any undue pressure on the bearing surface. So you basically want all the pressure on this outer edge as you're driving it in. So then we thought maybe we could put this on a bench grinder and grind it down a little bit and use this as a driver. But this steel is really hard, and I think my grinder wheel just isn't up to the task, and it was going to take forever to grind this down to use it as a driver to where this wouldn't get stuck in. It would be able to slide in and out of the bore of the hub without getting stuck. So then I was thinking maybe I'll just use a brass drift to drive it in. But then I thought, what else do I have on my tool arsenal? And this driver tool right here, I got this from my buddy Dwayne that makes the really nicely designed rear axle tools for Toyota and Lexus owners. And this was made to drive in the bearing into the bearing case of a 3rd generation 4Runner or 1st gen Tacoma. I think it would work for 1st gen Tundras too. And it ends up, it's the perfect diameter to be able to hit this upper surface to drive it in. and it doesn't get stuck in the bore. So we could use this to drive it till it's fully seated and it's not going to get stuck. So now what I'll do is I'll take a measurement of this tool and show you what it is so you could be better prepared for this job if you're going to replace the races. So it looks like it's around 89 millimeters. Let me change that to inches. It's like 3.5 inches wide. So hopefully this knowledge will help you be better prepared to knock in the races, or like I said, you just go for it with a brass drift and try to drive it in, working your way around the circumference till it's fully seated against the step inside the hub. So what I'm going to do to prepare for the insertion of the race is I'm going to lubricate the surface a little bit with some wheel bearing grease, just so the insertion goes easier. And I'm going to put a little bit on the race itself. Now this is important. The wider flat side goes down and the tapered side faces up. So don't get that wrong. So to get this started, I'm going to start off with just a plastic block and I'm going to knock it in flush with the surface of the hub here, right where the ABS tone ring is. Okay, that's pretty much flush. I'm going to try this metal plate, see if I can get it a little bit in further. Now we're going to have to switch to this tool and start hammering it in. And I just got to be careful that I don't have it glance off the sides. I'm just being really careful, resetting, make sure the installation tool is aligned well with the race, and just give it a couple whacks. Go on the other side, go across here. And you get the idea. I'm going to slowly work this down into its fully seated position. Once it's driven in far enough to where this thing can't slip off the edge of the race, then it gets a lot easier. And that solid sound lets me know that it's fully driven in. I'll just give it a couple more whacks. Really solid, 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 solid. The way you can tell that this is fully driven in is flip it over and then use a headlamp or flashlight and just look around the inside and see that the race is fully up against the shoulder that it's meant to stop at. And I could see that it's fully seated, so we're good to go. For the smaller race, one of my OTC pucks is going to work. The number on it is 4507-7. And then I'll show you what a properly fitting race driver looks like. So you put the tapered end towards the tapered end and see how the edge of the tool strikes the top, but you're really not putting any force on the bearing surface. That's what you want. So I'll insert it. I got it all greased up. It slides in pretty far on its own, and then it hits the area where you need to drive it in. So this should be a lot easier. Solid sound. You hear that solid sound? That means it's fully driven in, but I'll flip it over and I'll do a visual inspection. Yep, it looks like it's driven in fully. Okay, so we got both of the races in. We're getting ready to install the new bearings. We packed that void that I talked about earlier with a bunch of the CV2 wheel bearing grease. And then now what we're gonna do is we're gonna use my wheel bearing grease packer to grease the bearings. Some guys will do it the old-fashioned way. They'll get a blob of grease in their hand and they'll slowly work it into the bearing. But once you use a bearing grease packer, it's way better than that old school way. Here's the bearing grease packer here. This thing is 2 pieces. You fill the bottom with a bunch of grease and you insert it, smush it down, and then take this plunger out. This plunger screws into the bottom piece. You unscrew that, you put the bearing in with the narrow side facing down and the wider side facing up. And so this piece is gonna go right into the top of the bearing. And then as I push down, grease is gonna come up through holes in here. I'll move some of the grease out of the way so you can see it. You see those holes? The grease is going to come up through those holes and push into the roller bearings. So I'm going to push it down with a lot of force until I see grease coming out through the rollers. I'll stop there, and now you can really see it. All the rollers have grease popping through. I'm just going to push a little more. You got to put some strength into this. Okay, take a look at that. So that's what you're looking for. And then you take the plunger out and you pull your bearing out. And then what I like to do is just coat the outside of the bearing with a bunch of the grease. I really don't think you could over grease this thing, so the more the merrier in my opinion. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bunch of grease right in here on the race that it rides on. And then I'm going to drop that bearing in. And the narrower side faces down. You really can only get this in one way. If you try the other way, it's not going to work. So now that the bearing is in there, we have to knock in the grease seal on the back of the hub. There is a natural stop for this seal. So I got my little pointer tool on it right now. So you just drive the seal in till it meets up with that shoulder, and then you've got a fully driven in seal. And there's two distinct sides to the seal, so don't get it in wrong. This side faces up in the orientation we're looking at it. This side with this raised edge, that faces the bearing. Don't get it in backwards. So I'm going to put it in right, get it started, and then I'm just going to use this plastic block as a driver to drive it in. And this steel plate is a flatter surface than that block, so I'm going to just put this on there and give it a couple more whacks. Okay, the seal's fully driven in. In the upcoming footage, you're going to see us replace a seal at the back of the steering knuckle, and you're going to be wondering, wait a minute, I never saw you guys remove the steering knuckle, and that's because we didn't show it in the video. Vincent and I were filming 4 jobs at the same time, and it got a little bit convoluted on what we were filming for each video, and we forgot to document the removal of the steering knuckle because we did that as part of the CV Axle Reboot video we were doing. So you're going to see how we went about removing that old seal and installing the new one. I do think that you can replace that seal with the steering knuckle still on the vehicle. It might be a little bit harder, but I'm pretty sure you can do it. So you can try to do the seal replacement with the steering knuckle still on. If you choose to remove the steering knuckle and you want some information on how to remove that steering knuckle from the vehicle, we did document the removal of the whole steering knuckle and hub and rotor assembly for the CV Axle Reboot video. So I'll link that video in the video description and provide a timestamp at the point we start disconnecting the necessary things to get that steering knuckle off the vehicle. You basically have to break free the lower ball joint from the steering knuckle. You have to disconnect the upper ball joint from the control arm, and then you have to disconnect the steering knuckle arm from the steering knuckle, and then you can remove that whole assembly off. All right, let's get back to the video. We're going to replace this seal at the back of the steering knuckle. This seal interfaces with the outside joint of the CV axle, and it keeps water, dirt, and other debris from getting into the hub area where that needle bearing is to protect it. One way you can do it is maybe with a 2 or 3 jaw slide hammer puller and see if you can pull it off, because there is a little bit of a lip that you can grab onto. And then another way is you just come in with a screwdriver or a drift and hit it at an angle and get underneath the lip. But what's going to be hard is being able to hit it from this side because the brake dust shield's in the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this brake dust shield off so we can get in there with a screwdriver or a brass drift easier to pull this off, because I don't think I'm going to try to get this with the slide hammer puller. Okay, I got my 1/4 inch gun and the 12mm socket. Let's zip these out. There is a proper orientation to this. You see this hole right here? So you got to make sure that lines up. So keep it in that same orientation. Now I'm going to bring this over to my bench vise. I've got it captured in the bench vise with the soft jaws so it doesn't mess up the spindle. And then now I'm gonna come in here with a screwdriver and see if I can knock this thing up. I'm gonna spin it and get a different angle. It's coming.
Do not.
I'm gonna come.
See if I could get it out more on this side. There it is. Let me give you the inside diameter of this new seal so you can get an idea of the size driver tool you can use to drive it in. So I'm measuring in millimeters right now, and it looks to be about 97.5 millimeters. In inches, it looks like 38.4 inches. I have this old bearing race. This is from a front wheel bearing for a Toyota or a Lexus that has the unit bearings. It's a double race bearing. The diameter of this is 37.8 inches, or in millimeters, it's about 96 millimeters. This old bearing race makes good contact with the seal so I can drive right up against this edge. I don't want to hit the seal and I don't want to dent the outside lip. So you want something that fits in there. You could just try to do it with a brass drift, hitting on the lip, going side to side, back and forth, and do it that way, but I'm going to do it this way. I put a little bit of multi-purpose grease in here to make the seal insertion easier. I'm going to set it in here, place this in there. I'm going to put this metal plate over the top to drive against, and then I'm going to drive the seal in. That sounded solid. 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 Okay, it's fully driven in. And no damage happened to the seal. And you'll notice I have a rag here because I didn't want to dump any debris into the little needle bearing that's inside there. I wanted to keep that as clean as possible. I'm going to get the brake dust shield back in place. And remember that this indentation lines up with the hole on the knuckle. So get that in the right orientation. So slide this over first. You see it's got the notch there for the hole. That divot indentation goes right there too. Then I'm going to get all the bolts started. I'm sure there's a torque spec for this, but I really don't care. I'm just going to go by feel with a small ratchet that doesn't have a lot of mechanical advantage. Now that we have this new seal installed, you can see this needle bearing. I'm thinking it's probably a good time to put some bearing grease in there before we put the hub back on. I'm going to pack a little bit of grease in this roller bearing and just move it around, try to work it into the rollers. In the upcoming footage of showing you how to get the hub and rotor assembly back onto the vehicle, you're going to notice that there's brand new rotors on there and we didn't show replacing them. And the reason why is we were filming a brake job on Vincent's vehicle at the same time filming this job and two other jobs. So we chose not to include the brake job as part of this video because we think some people aren't going to be doing the brakes as part of this job. They might just be doing the wheel bearings. So we didn't want to make the video any longer than it had to be. But if you wanted to see that brake video, we will link that in the video description for you so you can watch it. So I just wanted to let you know that so you're not confused, like, wait a minute, you got new rotors and then now you're putting old calipers and pads onto those new rotors. It doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't make sense. And it was because we were filming that brake job video at the same time as filming this. So with that said, let's get back to the video. Now that we have the races replaced, the rear bearing in, the back seal in, now we're ready to get the hub back onto the steering knuckle. I'm going to prepare by putting some grease on all surfaces. So right in the back here, this is where the hub assembly interfaces with that back seal. So I'm going to lubricate that so the seal will last longer. And then I'm just going to lubricate all the other surfaces. And it's a really windy day here, making it really difficult for us to not get a bunch of grit where we don't want it. Frickin' wind is gnarly today. I'm going to lubricate the splines of the CV axle too. All right, I'm not going to waste any time. We're going to grab the hub and slide it over. Okay, I've got the hub assembly. I'm going to slide it over. And I'm just going to leave it right there for right now. Now we got to grab our outer bearing and we're going to slide that in place. I'm sliding the outer bearing in. Now I'm going to install the claw washer. This has two distinct sides. One is flatter than the other side. This side is a little more rounded. I'm going to put this side towards the outer bearing. And remember, it's keyed, so you have to find the key in the hub spindle and slide it in place, just like that. Now I'm going to install the adjuster nut. The adjuster nut is just the first nut that goes against the claw washer and sets the bearing preload. These nuts, again, have a distinct flat side and a more rounded side. I'm going to put the flat side towards the claw washer. And I'm just going to run that in by hand all the way against the claw washer. That's snugged up. And now I got to grab my 54 millimeter socket and my torque wrench, and I'm going to torque it to 43 foot-pounds. I have my torque wrench set to 43 foot-pounds, and I'm going to tighten this up. Okay, that's at 43 foot-pounds. Now what I'm going to do is turn the hub each way a few turns to try to settle the bearing. And then now I'm going to come back in with the torque wrench and re-torque it to 43 foot-pounds. You see how that moved a little bit? So the bearing settled. I'm going to try it one more time. I'm going to do it a few turns each way, and I'm going to re-torque it again, just for extra measure. Okay, I think I'm going to do that a third time because it's still not fully seating. Okay, now that stayed pretty much right at the spec and I couldn't turn it. Now what I'm going to do is loosen it to where I can spin it by hand. Okay, I could spin it by hand, and now the directions say to re-torque it to 57 inch-pounds. So I'm going to grab my inch-pound torque wrench, and that's a really light torque spec. Okay, that's it. Now what we have to do is grab our fish scale and see how much bearing preload we have. The suggested spec is 9.5 to 15 foot-pounds. So you grab your fish scale, you hook it on a stud that's about 12 o'clock, you pull the fish scale until the whole rotor assembly starts to move, and then check your value. And that's barely nothing. That only went to 5 foot-pounds, so we need a little bit more preload on that bearing. So the preload isn't where I want it to be, so I'm going to tighten up the adjuster nut a little bit, and then I'm going to get back on my fish scale and check it out again. That's about 7 foot-pounds. I'm going to go a little higher. I kept on tightening the nut, spinning the assembly both ways a few times, and then kept checking it. It took several tightenings. I would just tighten it just a little bit and then recheck it. And now we have it right about 12. That's at least what it came out the last time we pulled on this. All right, I think I finally got it to where we want it at about 12 pounds of force. And it was 11 this time. It's in the ballpark, so I'm just going to call it good because sometimes I pull it, it's 12, sometimes I pull it's 11. I think we're happy with that. We're in the spec, and we're going to call that good. Now we're going to put a lock washer on there. Again, it's keyed. And then we're going to get our lock nut on here. Have the flat side facing the lock washer and spin that on. Now we're going to torque the lock nut to 47 foot-pounds. Okay, now I'm going to get back on here with my fish scale and just double check our work. And technically I was showing you wrong. You're supposed to pull the fish scale in the direction the wheel spins, which it spins in both directions if you really think about it, because you can go in reverse, but let's just follow what they said and check it out. So that actually increased to 13 foot-pounds. I'm going to try that again. I'm going to give it a few spins. Started to move. Yeah, it's somewhere in between 12 and 13. So that's perfect. That's right in the middle of the spec. That's what we want. Now what we have to do is bend over the lock washer. One tab needs to go over the adjuster nut and another tab needs to go over the lock nut. So what you do is you find a tab that mates up with the flat side of each nut. So I can see that this tab right here is going to fold over the back adjuster nut really nicely. And then for the front one, this one's pretty close. I think I'll bend this one forward. You can see all these other ones, like right here, that's going to catch the corner. That's right on the corner, and that's also going to catch the corner. So I think these two side by side are going to be the best ones. So I'm going to knock this one in over the adjuster nut. Just be careful of the studs here, don't damage them. Okay, that's folded over. And then now I'm just going to get in here and fold this one forward. There we go. That's better. Okay, that's folded over. It's good to go. We're going to get a new flange gasket installed, and it looks like these two that are close to ones next to it are the pin ones. There we go. That's in there. We're going to grab the new flange, and you can see the two alignment pins right here are going to align with those. Now we got to grab our cone washers, slide those in place. And then we'll follow that up with a flat washer. And then finally the nuts. I got all the nuts on and then I cinched them down snug with a short ratchet in a crossing pattern. Okay, they're all pretty snug. Now I'm going to transition to the torque wrench. The torque spec for the nuts that affix the flange to the hub is 24 foot-pounds. And what's going to end up happening is the rotor is going to spin on me, so I'll see if I can hold it firm with my hand. I don't think I'm going to be able to hold it. So what I'm going to do is going to get a couple lug nuts on here and then get a pry bar in between to hold it. I have the pry bar securing the assembly so I can torque them. Okay, that hit. That hit. Hit. Good. And then I'm gonna have to reset and see if I can get this last one. I'm gonna just try to hold it right there. Okay, they're all torqued to 24 foot-pounds. Now I'm gonna get this snap ring installed on the end of the CV axle. If you don't see the snap ring groove visible, then that means that the CV axle needs to be pulled further in to the hub. I can see it, but I'm just gonna pull on this a little more, make sure I can get it. Okay, I'm gonna get my snap ring pliers and install it. Okay, we've got the snap ring in the groove, and then just to test, I'm gonna pound on this and make sure that the CV axle can't pop inward. Okay, that's a good sign. So now we're gonna grab our new dust cover and knock this in place. I think I'm gonna put a little bit of grease on here to help with the insertion. There we go. All right, that's fully driven in. Now we're getting the ABS line reconnected where it needs to reconnect. The first connection is this bracket that goes to this other bracket that attaches to the steering knuckle. It's a 12mm bolt. I'm just going to tighten that by feel. No torque value. Okay, that's good. The next connection is right here. It's a 10mm. And again, I'm just going to tighten that by feel with a small ratchet. I said that wrong. It's actually a 12mm. And that's tight. Now we have to plug in the ABS sensor into the knuckle. I'm going to clean this off a little bit. This one is a 10mm. So I'm going to insert that. And again, I'm just going to tighten this by feel, no torque value. Because our grimy hands have been all over the rotors, and also because new rotors come with a protective spray on them so they don't rust, I cleaned off both sides of the rotor with brake cleaner and a clean rag. And now I'm gonna get the caliper slid over the rotor. And I think what I'm gonna do is have Vincent turn the wheel all the way to the left, because we're working on the passenger side, to open this up to where I have an easier time getting the caliper bolts in. Okay, I'm gonna slide the caliper over the rotor, and then I'm gonna get my bolt started. Okay, I got the bottom one started. I'm gonna get the top one started. Okay, both of them are started. I'm just gonna cinch them down first and then get out the torque wrench. The torque spec for these caliper bolts is 90 foot-pounds. All right, Vincent and I did a double check of all our work. We looked at all the fasteners that we took off and made sure they're all back on. They're all torqued to the proper value, or to that German spec or torque elbow of good and tight. Now, finally, we are at the point that we get the tires on. We're gonna torque the lug nuts to 85 foot-pounds, and we will be done with this job. Thank God. All right, we are all done with this job. As you saw, it's not exactly easy, but it's not exactly super hard either to replace the wheel bearings and the wheel bearing races on your Lexus LX470 or your Toyota 100 Series Land Cruiser. There was one moment that I was thinking, oh shit, we don't have the right tool to drive in that bigger race. And it was just dumb luck that I had that driver puck from my buddy Dwayne that makes the rear axle tools for Toyota and Lexus SUVs and trucks, and it fit perfectly. I did do a little bit of investigating online, and I did find a kit from Lyle or Lizzle, and they do have a seal driver puck that's 3.5 inches, like that tool that I had from my buddy Dwayne. So I will put a link in the video description to that kit if you wanted to get that, so you can have the proper size seal driving puck for your application. While you're doing this job, there's lots of options for you to do other things while you're in there. You can upgrade the brakes like Vincent and I did. If you want to see that video, click on the link above. You have the option of rebooting your CV axles if they're torn, and we actually did that too. So if you want to see that video, click on the link above. We also, because we pulled out the CV axles, we replaced the differential axle seals, and we filmed that. So if you want to see that video, click on the link above. And there's other things you can replace while you're in there. You can do your ball joints. You can maybe take the lower control arm off and do the control arm bushings. Like I said, there's lots of options to do things while you're in that deep with the steering knuckle off the vehicle, to where you have better access to do some other jobs. For the sequence of preloading the bearing, I found on multiple applications that the factory service manual information isn't that accurate to get the proper preload with your fish scale measuring it to get it right. So we followed the instructions, we tightened it, we spun it, then we loosened it, then we retightened it to a very light inch-pound torque value, and no way was that bearing preloaded properly. So I just had to keep on tightening and tightening that adjusting nut until I got it to where I was happy with it. And after locking down the lock nut, the second nut, we came up with somewhere around the 12 to 13 pounds of preload. And that was really good, because that was somewhere in the middle of the spec of 9.5 to 15 pounds. So I imagine you're going to find the same thing when you do this job on your 100 series or your LX470. You're going to find that you have to tighten that adjuster nut quite a bit more to get the preload of the bearing correct. And with the bearing, it's bad to have it too tight, and it's not so great to have it too loose. You want a proper preload on that bearing so it doesn't wear out. Vincent and I are in agreement. The reason why that bearing on that passenger side was loose was because the person who did the job didn't properly preload that bearing. When I got onto those nuts with the 54 millimeter socket, they were hand tight. They were not tight enough. And that's why that bearing had play in it. I don't even know 100% the bearing was bad, but it definitely wasn't preloaded correctly by the last mechanic or DIY guy that did it. All right, I think I blah-blahed enough. We thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Vincent. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what the hell you're waiting for. Click on that subscribe button. Also, click on that notification bell if you'd like to be notified when we put up new content on our channel, which we are always putting up very helpful and sick mods kind of content. So don't miss out. Peace out. Happy wrenching. Bye-bye.